Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by Dr. Ronald Brown. And today's topic is one of the most magnificent avenues in the world. This is the Champs-Élysées in Paris, which can rightly be called the queen of all great avenues. It's been imitated. It has become part of the modern urban landscape. Well, it wasn't always that way, as we're going to find out. There have been times when cities were squeezed into narrow walled compounds, and the idea of a grand avenue taking up all this space was not possible. So why did Paris decide to carve the Champs-Élysées out of its urban area and create what became the prototype of all modern great avenues? So our outline for today, the history of the Voie Triomphale, the idea of a grand avenue for public displays and public buildings cutting through the center of the city. What is the history of this concept? Then medieval Paris. Where did Paris come into this? Into the history of great cities? What kind of city was it? Then came along Kings Louis XIV and Louis XV, 14th and 15th Louis, who left their imprint on Paris and on the emergence of the Champs-Élysées. The emergence of the Champs-Élysées as the stage for great urban and national, even international events. And then more recently, the decision to extend the Champs-Élysées and take it out into the suburbs, an ever-growing, ever-lengthening grand boulevard. And then the Champs-Élysées in popular culture, how it has become a symbol in itself. You can't go to Paris without visiting Notre Dame, the Arc de Triomphe, and of course, strolling along the Champs-Élysées. So let's get started with our topic for today, the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, the queen of all avenues. Well, the idea of a voie or a street triomphal, triumphant, a triumphant avenue, a triumphant way is deeply rooted in the emergence of the great empires and kingdoms of the ancient world. On the left, we see the great capital of, which is today Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, the great avenue with temples along each side, flanked by the Temple of the Sun on one side, the Temple of the Moon. You can only imagine what great dramatic rituals took place in this triumphant way. On the right, we see the modern city of Beijing or Peking. In the middle, you see a small yellow square. That is what we call the Forbidden City. But in front of it and behind it, stretching down, is the Great Triumphant Way, an avenue that transects the city from the far north down to the deep south. Once again, triumphant ways, triumphant avenues were associated with greatness, with empire, with victory, as the word triumphant communicates. On the left, we see the ancient ruins of the city of Babylon. The pink area in the center was the famous ziggurat, and in front of it stretched a great urban avenue down to the Marduk Gate, passing through the walls. Even behind it, you see across the bridge, the continuation of a grand avenue lined with temples of the various gods. On the right, we see Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. Once again, a great avenue going from the north gate down to the south gate, continuing down with temples on either side. And the much visited Angkor Wat is only one of the more minor temples along this giant north-south axis. Well, when Peter the Great decided that he was going to build a brand new capital for his ever-growing Russian Empire, he laid out the famous Nevsky Prospect, a broad street, not like these narrow medieval streets, but it was a broad avenue, magnificent sidewalks, palaces, churches, stores, all along each side. This was a celebration of the triumph of Russia emerging into modern European and world history. Berlin, when the Hohenzollerns decided to embellish their small capital city of the rising Prussian Empire, they laid out a magnificent boulevard of Unter den Linden, going from the cathedral and the university and the central buildings, stretching down along in front of various museums, ending in the famous Brandenburg Gate, and continuing beyond Brandenburg Gate into the Tiergarten. Once again, a celebration of the rising power and influence of Germany through the building of a great monumental avenue. And this impulse continues until today. Recently, I was in Brasilia, the brand new capital of Brazil, one of the major emerging world powers. Well, when the government of Brazil decided to cut its ties with ancient Europe and celebrate the rise of Brazil as a new country seeking world greatness, what did they do? They hired Niemeyer and another group of architects to build a brand new capital. On the left, you see the map. Some people call it a butterfly, some people call it a bird, some people call it an airplane. But the two wings join at the long boulevard, which cuts diagonally across the picture. And there you see me standing on a bridge over the Grand Avenue. It's as much a park as it is an avenue with traffic, lined on both sides with government ministries, the palace of the president, the cathedral of Brazil, museums, and just behind my head at the far end of this Grand Avenue is the National Congress of Brazil. So once again, until today, grand avenues have celebrated the greatness or the aspirations to greatness of world empires. Well, Paris started out as a small town on the Ile de la Cité. This is the island in the middle of the Seine River where Notre Dame is located. And that was the Roman outpost, which they called Lutetia, the town. Well, the tribe of Celts who lived in the area were called the Parisi. So while the Celts have been assimilated into the modern French nation, but the name Parisi remains as the capital of this new emerging identity. Well, the Romans by the 3rd century were expanding north, conquering Britain and Belgium and Holland and waging war on Germany. And so they built a capital for their province of Gaul, which they named Laetitia. Well, it was a rather small town in the beginning, located on the island. But as it grew in importance, it became a major city. In the picture, we see the ruins of the thermal baths. The Romans loved their giant monumental bathhouses, which were a combination of saunas and conference halls where meetings were held with the men lounging in hot water and soaking away their excess pounds and alcohol and relaxing. And this remains on the Boulevard Saint-Germain-des-Prés as a ruin. As you can see, parts have been reconstructed. On the right, that's me down in one of the lower rooms. And there you see a giant stone bathtub, which according to the little card on the side was actually made in Italy and shipped to this new town of Laetitia to give it an air of sophistication. So under the Romans, their little town of Laetitia began to grow. Now it had a major street. If you look at the map on the left, you see the island of Elysee in the middle of the Seine River. And you see vaguely what was built later during the Middle Ages, and that is Notre Dame Cathedral. But the big boulevard that cuts across the city diagonally is today called Rue de la Cité when you're on the island. And it takes on various names on either side. But this was the main drag of the Roman city, which was simply taken and extended in both directions as the city grew into medieval Paris. But beyond this major highway, the city was medieval. If you look at the map on the right, you see the Latin Quarter. Well, there are narrow streets intersecting at strange angles, churches here and churches there, curving streets, narrow streets, typical medieval city where the streets were narrow. Sometimes a carriage couldn't even get by. It was for walking, people riding horses and carrying packages on their back. It was a type of congested medieval city inside the city walls, because in the Middle Ages, wars were all over the place, invasions. And so the city had to protect itself by building the walls around the city and then cramming everybody inside. Here we see Paris, as it grew during the Middle Ages, still enclosed in its city walls. Once again, you can still see the outline of the main street going across about mid-photo, the gates through the city walls and then into the city walls, crossing the old medieval crowded city, and then leaving the city walls and the moat. Well, these walls are long gone, but at the very bottom, you see what eventually emerged as the Great Palace of the Louvre. But yet you can see that on the top half of the wall is the original fortress palace of the Louvre with some little gardens around it. But then you had the city wall with the various gates. And beyond the city wall, there were the beginnings of the gardens of the Tuileries, which were the Louvre gardens, but still the city wall chopped off the early Louvre castle or fortress from future expansion. Now, today, the walls are gone except for tiny segments. The one segment I know well is the famous Porte de Saint-Denis, the Gate of St. Denis, which was on both sides covered with a wall. And when you went through the gate, if you were a farmer living out in the country, you got in your wagon pulled by your horse and filled with your potatoes or whatever you were selling. And when you went through the gate, you had to pay a tax to enter the city. So the gates were defensive, the walls were defensive, but they also were a main source of revenue for the city. Well, the medieval city is pretty well gone, but you do see the narrow streets, which have remained. You see a lot of these old wooden buildings. Running down the middle of a lot of streets was the open sewer, where hopefully a big rain would wash away the human waste and the garbage, but that wasn't always the case. So you can imagine the smell of the medieval city. People crowded into rooms, one upon the other, constantly prone to fire and to diseases. On the right, you see again a picture which remains not too long ago of the rather modest rundown houses which filled the medieval city with what we would call today slums. Of course, the slums were ravaged by disease. It was not at all uncommon for a pandemic or an epidemic of tuberculosis, of typhus, of cholera, of the flu, influenza, who knew what, to sweep through the city, and the city would hire wagons to go through, carrying away the dead. The survivors would simply take the dead body of the person and put it on the sidewalk in front of the building, where it would lay sometimes for hours, if not a day, before it would be picked up and dumped into a common grave. C'est Le Petit Journal and its depiction of a cholera epidemic sweeping through Europe. So the city inside the walls was not really a very wonderful place. Well, inside the wall at the bottom of the picture that we saw earlier was the original Louvre. And as you can see from these two pictures, it was a fortress. It was defensive. It was inside the walls. And you see the walls in both periods with their towers to protect the king from invaders, and very often as not to protect the king from uprisings by his people. So the king was not only fighting off foreign invaders from his castle, but also uprisings among the local people. But as you can see, it was inside the walls. There were no Tuileries Gardens, there was no Champs-Élysées, there was nothing beyond the original fortress. Well, gradually in the 1500s, the fortress lost its defensive characteristics. Gradually, the walls and the gates were torn down. And as you can see on the right, you see the Louvre, which still has its fortress-looking shape in the middle of the picture, but gradually the Grand Galerie was built, and another part, the Palais de Tuileries, was gradually built, but this was only accomplished with the demolition of the city wall. So gradually, the fortress was being turned into a residence, into a palace, and not a fortress. Well, Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, emerged as one of the great kings of France. He ruled from 1643 to 1715. Well, like all of his predecessors, he'd lived in Paris, he'd lived in the Louvre fortress, and which was gradually growing and expanding into more of a palace as the danger of wars diminished. Well, Louis, like all of the kings, had his little country estate. And this was Versailles, which was out of the city in an open forested area where the kings would go and get on their horses with their nobles and go hunting deer, go hunting, wolf hunting, boar, wild pig hunting. And so they had their little bungalow in the country, which you see as it looked in 1652. And this was where Louis XIV, the great Sun King, would spend weekends. He'd take a group of his nobles, and you can see it even has a fortress aspect. Surrounded by water, it had its towers on either corner, and it was defensive in nature. So you call it a fort, which became a hunting lodge. Well, Louis XIV did not abandon Louvre at first. In fact, he was responsible for the gradual tearing down of the wall, tearing down of the gates to the city, and opening up the Louvre to an expansive area in front of it, which gradually, under his guidance, was transformed into a very beautiful formal garden, which we see in the picture on the left. It's an early spring picture. You can see the fruit trees are blooming. This eventually became the Jardin de Tuileries, the Tuileries Gardens. And as you can see, everything is geometric. The basin is octagonal. You have the Grand Carré, which is round. You have the street layout, which every avenue is at a right or a left angle, 90 degrees. So gradually, Louis XIV was enjoying his life in Paris. Well, in the 1640s and 50s, a group of business people, the rising middle class in Paris, periodically rose in revolt, demanding more freedoms for the new business class, opposing the nobles who controlled everything, even demanding a constitution or a parliament where they would have representatives. Well, of course, Louis XIV was not very thrilled with all of this, and he put down the so-called Fronde revolutions. Well, he went even further, realizing that most of the rising middle class, the urban business people, tradesmen, were largely Protestants, whether they were Huguenots, French Protestants, or they were Lutherans and Reformed Christians in other parts of France. Louis XIV decided that he was going to put down this rising tide of revolution. He expelled and massacred the Huguenots. He rounded up the Lutherans and other Protestants and gave them a choice of either fleeing with their lives or being exterminated. Well, on the right, you see a picture of my great-great-great-great-grandparents who were from Alsace-Lorraine, which had been occupied by France. They were German-speaking and fiercely Protestant. So when Louis XIV started expelling and massacring the Huguenots and other Protestants, my ancestors packed up and eventually found their way to southern Pennsylvania in the 1700s, and they remained there to escape the religious persecution of Louis XIV. Well, Louis XIV decided that Paris was just racked with revolutionaries. The growing urban middle class was educated and wanted more freedoms, even political representation. So he literally abandoned the Louvre, went to Versailles, and gradually expanded it from a hunting lodge to a palace, and eventually becoming the Palace of Versailles that all visitors to Paris must visit. Giant gardens, no longer a hunting lodge. Nobles built their homes in Versailles. Everything arranged with a to be as impressive and as elegant as possible. Well, Louis XV decided to move back to Paris in the early and mid 1700s. So Versailles became his place outside the city, but his real love was the Louvre. So he was the one who spurred further development of the Louvre. Now, why was the Louvre, and especially his love, the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, why was that so important to him? Well, look at him. Look at the way he's dressed. His crown on the table, standing in his beautiful robes. I mean, he was intent on making himself the greatest king that France had ever known. He was the one who set out to create a great French empire in North America, what is today Quebec, the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi Valley to New Orleans. He took over places in India, setting up trading depots, started French expansion into Africa, the island of Haiti, other islands in the Pacific. He was going to make France great, and he would be the greatest king. He was called Louis le Bien-Aimé, meaning Louis, the much loved king, because he had a flamboyant lifestyle. He not only dressed like he was king of the world, but his famous lover, Madame de Pompadour, in the picture, he severely limited the powers of the French Parliament, kept control over Paris with his secret police, and let everybody know, I am number one. Well, the walls were being demolished at a good pace. On the left, you see, once again, the city inside the walls. The X at the bottom, you see this section of the wall that separated the Louvre and the gardens that were gradually being built from what eventually became the Champs-Élysées. So it was necessary to demolish the wall. Well, just for those of you who have visited Paris, the wall is no longer there except for some gates. But a second wall was built much further out, and that you see in the picture on the right. It was called the Thiers Wall, built in the 1840s, which of course is today long gone. But on its place was built the famous Boulevard Périphérique. This is the circular road going around an ever-expanding Paris. I've been on that highway half a dozen times because no matter where you want to go in Paris, it's easy to go to the Périphérique, zip around the city, and then go into the city from where you want to go. Well, on the left, we see the Tour du Coin and the Tour du Bois. Those are the two towers, which were parts of the old wall around the Louvre. You see the Porte Saint-Honoré, and you see the extension of the wall and the moat in front of it. And this was demolished in 1732. Even the Porte Saint-Honoré was demolished. That's the gate you see on the right with the segment of the wall. So once this was demolished, it opened up the Louvre to expand into the Tuileries Gardens and eventually the whole way up the Champs-Élysées. Well, the first big construction was, once the wall was torn down, on the ruins of the wall and a big area surrounding it, was built the Place de la Concorde in 1772. Well, this was a big open square. Place in French means an open square, like we'd say a place in English. In this big square, which was left open except for monuments in the middle to various kings, palaces, and government buildings were built around it. And it remains until today a big open square filled with traffic, but still a very monumental square. Now, it achieved fame as the place where all Parisians could gather to witness what was public entertainment in the 1700s. They didn't have big screen TVs and Broadway shows in the 1700s, so the biggest entertainment was the execution of criminals. It was in the Place de la Concorde that Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette lost their heads. During the Revolution, Robespierre was beheaded in the Place de la Concorde. So it marked the beginning of the expansion of the Louvre, the gardens, demolition of the wall and the gates, and the building of a big new square called the Place de la Concorde. Today, the Place de la Concorde is dominated by the obelisk of Luxor, which was given by the King of Egypt in the 1800s to France in 1836. And it was transported from Luxor in Egypt to Paris. Another one was given to New York City, and that is the famous Cleopatra's Needle, which stands in the garden behind the Metropolitan Museum in Central Park. But it was really a technological adventure, lowering the obelisk without breaking it, transporting it to the port of Alexandria by ship to France, overland to Paris, and then raising this one piece of stone without breaking it. Even in New York, when the Cleopatra's Needle was brought, it was a sight to see as it was transported from ship across Manhattan to Central Park. Well, the Place de la Concorde marked a big event, not just the demolition of the city wall and the gates, but the gardens of the Louvre, the Tuileries, ended with the Place de la Concorde, and beyond Place de la Concorde emerged a brand new avenue, and this was called the Champs-Élysées. Champs simply means a field where you have cows or big open grassy space for animals. Elysee comes from the Greek legend of the Elysian fields, was the place where Greek gods and great Greek heroes lived eternally. It was sort of like the heaven reserved for gods and heroes, not the ordinary people. On the picture on the right, you see Place de la Concorde, and then the Champs-Élysées stretching down to the vast intersection of half a dozen streets where the Arc de Triomphe is currently located. So it is a beautiful stretch of Avenue, the extension of the gardens of the Louvre. Picture on the left, you see a view from atop the Arc de Triomphe, looking down the Champs-Élysées. You see the obelisk right in the middle of the picture, and they have set up periodically a entertainment area there, the Ferris wheel. And then at the end, you see the Louvre Palace. Well, this was a monumental undertaking. You can see how broad it is with cars in the middle, but yet huge extension of sidewalks and trees on either side and buildings. So the area had to be cleaned out, the avenue laid out, and trees planted, and rows of buildings had to be built on either side. Now, what is unique about the Champs-Élysées is that unlike other grand avenues, such as Fifth Avenue, which is filled with churches and restaurants and hotels and clubs and giant department stores, the Champs-Élysées was not marked by monumental buildings. They were apartment buildings. Very few major buildings are on the Champs-Élysées, but magnificent buildings are on either side, but at a distance. One of the buildings, which was incorporated into the Champs-Élysées, which is actually not on the Champs-Élysées, is a famous Palais de Elysee. This is the residence, the palace of the President of France, built in 1722 as a palace for the king. It is now the residence of Monsieur Macron, who is the President of France today. So if you look at the map on the right, you see the Champs-Élysées, but the major buildings are not on the Champs-Élysées. It is a park. You have the Palais de l'Élysée, where the gardens in front of the Palais have been incorporated into the gardens of the Champs-Élysées, but the palace itself is at a distance. On the other side of the street, you see the Petit Palais and what was formerly the Grand Palais. You see theater, and nothing is on the Champs-Élysées. It is a beautiful building, apartment-lined avenue with the monumental buildings away from the avenue. Originally, the plan was to plant elm trees. Now, the elm tree is a magnificent tree, as you can see it on the left. This is in Central Park in the mall, which is an avenue filled with elm trees. The elm trees spread out. They form a magnificent canopy. Well, unfortunately, a disease called the Dutch elm disease was a pandemic crossing around the world and started killing the elm trees. Central Park made a major effort to inoculate them, to develop a form or a species of elm tree that can resist the disease, the blight. But the French gave up on the elm tree and they replaced it with chestnut trees, which have a nice leafy aspect, and they can be easily trimmed into the typical French geometric patterns. So on the left, you see a typical English style garden with trees growing the way Mother Nature wanted them. But in France, they pruned the trees into geometric shapes. The Champs-Élysées is considered one of the widest avenues in the world. At 230 feet, it is almost 2.5 times as wide as Fifth Avenue, which is one of the widest avenues in New York City. So the plan was to have giant sidewalks with outdoor terraces and with trees, have an area for vehicles, a park in the middle with more trees and flowers, and then on the other side, another street in the other direction with another broad sidewalk. So the emphasis was on strolling along the Champs-Élysées with cafes, with restaurants, with little shops, newspaper stands, with a pedestrian emphasis. Now, one of the buildings off of the Champs-Élysées is the American Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, built 1864. It is an American English language church. It is Episcopal. It is part of the Episcopal diocese and part of the Episcopal church, but it presents itself as the American Cathedral. And wealthy Americans who started going to Paris on a regular basis, even living there for years at a time, would attend a church. It was one of the main social events of the American community in Paris. And as you can see from the picture on the right, with the coaches picking up well-dressed and well-heeled, wealthy American families after church and taking them to a restaurant or to one of their residences for Sunday dinner. One of the highlights of the Champs-Élysées area. To the south of Champs-Élysées, we were built in the early 1900s, the Petit Palais, which you see on the left, and the modern construction of the Grand Palais. These are exhibition centers where they have art exhibits constantly changing, world expositions, world's fairs, were the main attraction in these giant exposition centers. Once again, not on Champs-Élysées itself, but off in the gardens on either side of the Champs-Élysées. Well, one store that moved to the Champs-Élysées and took over a rather big building is the new Galerie Lafayette. Sure, if you've been to Paris, you've gone to the largest shopping center in Paris, and this is the Galerie Lafayette. On the right, you see the original Lafayette Gallery, magnificent domed interior, quite a shopping experience. Well, they built a branch called New Galerie Lafayette on the Champs-Élysées, and that's what you see on the picture on the left. One of the big shopping areas which have been gradually taking over the Champs-Élysées. Another place is the Café Georges V, named after King George V of Great Britain. There's even an avenue, Georges V. And here again, this is one of the pleasures of the Champs-Élysées, stopping off, watching people go by, very often noting famous people who are strolling by, trying to be incognito. And this is one of the more classy cafes. In fact, when my aunt was visiting, she's a Catholic nun, I took her to a nice restaurant in the French Quarter near the university where we had lunch, and oh, she was thrilled. Big long tables. You just go in, you sit beside the people there, you start conversations. Well, she loved it. She said, well, you paid for dinner, and so I'll pay for coffee. So I took her to the Georges V, and she had to pay twice as much for 2 cups of coffee as I paid for 2 dinners in the student restaurant. Needless to say, I reimbursed her for that, but she always tells that story of 2 cups of coffee costing twice as much as dinner. But hey, that's the Champs-Élysées, and that's the Georges V. The Georges V Hotel was built in 1928, once again off of the Champs-Élysées on the Avenue Georges V. Again, one of the more plush hotels in Paris. You will notice that it is reminiscent of the famous Paris architect Haussmann, the Baron Haussmann, who designed so many of the big avenues in Paris, but he also designed a type of building which is similar to these, where you have the balcony going across the building on the third floor, and on the top floor also, the balcony going the whole way around, with typical French windows which go from the ceiling to the floor, and you open them and you can step out into the balcony. It is a narrow balcony, so it's really not a balcony, but some people do put flowers on them and a couple of plants or use them for storage, but it's a typical Haussmannian building with the mansard roof, the sloping roof with the little windows. Those were the rooms for the female servants who helped and took care of the residents of the building, where they would have small rooms where 2 or 3 girls would have single beds, and that's where they would sleep at night. And then they could just come down the stairs, later on the elevator, to the apartment where they were working. Along the Champs-Élysées, they have started building more and more monuments. On the left, you see the monument to Lafayette. This was the great aide-de-camp to George Washington. In fact, many people say saved the career of George Washington as a military man. Went back to France and was a great hero of the French Revolution. In the middle, you see Winston Churchill, statue of him. On the right, a more recent addition are these crazy sculptures by Richard Orlinski. Brightly colored, very attractive crocodiles and all kinds of raging animals put up as displays, some temporary and some permanent. Well, then you get to the end of the Champs-Élysées proper, and that is the Arc de Triomphe. Or in French, they say Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile, meaning the Arc of Triumph in the star. You can see the streets which radiate out from it. Fascinating thing to do is to walk down one of these tree-lined streets and then go off on a side street. And behind these magnificent buildings, facing the big boulevards and streets, you're immediately back into the medieval city of narrow, winding streets. So this was the Arc de Triomphe, begun by Napoleon to celebrate his great victories in his conquest of Europe, only finished in 1836, but still containing the names of his great victories. So even though he was overthrown by the rest of the world and lived out the last years of his life in a small island in the Atlantic, still he is fondly remembered for the French Revolution and making France great. Underneath the Arc de Triomphe is the famous Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which was installed right after World War I to commemorate the soldiers lost between 14 and 18 in World War I. Many people say this is the very first of the eternal flames, that even Jackie Kennedy was so impressed by it that she adopted the same thing for the tomb of John Kennedy, her husband. And this is underneath the Arc of Triumph. Now that stretch of the Champs-Élysées from the Louvre Palace through the gardens, up the avenue to the Arc de Triomphe, has been a stage for major events, such as the marriage procession of Napoleon and his Austrian wife, Marie-Louise. This was a major event because Napoleon was an upstart colonel from the island of Corsica, which had only recently become part of France, spoke lousy French with a heavy accent. But when you have the power, then you aspire to intermarry with the great Austrian Habsburgs, the oldest reigning dynasty of Europe. And so that gave him a certain legitimacy. So his marriage procession was elaborate and really put the Champs-Élysées on the map. The Germans, following their occupation of Paris in 1871 and again in World War II, of course, had to celebrate their victory with a grand procession down the Champs-Élysées to show that the Germans now had won the war. Well, after World War II, of course, de Gaulle had to do the very same thing. See the sign, Vive de Gaulle, long live de Gaulle, going down with his tanks and military vehicles to celebrate the liberation of Paris from the Germans. On the right, you see a photograph of him, tall, very tall man, walking with his political and military leaders with the Arc de Triomphe in the background. Well, of course, every victorious leader of World War II had to have their march down the Champs-Élysées. You see General Eisenhower at the top, Winston Churchill at the bottom. You can see Winston Churchill and de Gaulle never got along very well. So the picture shows them looking in opposite directions, which is a metaphor for French-British relations after the war. On the right, you see various celebrations. 14th of July, French Independence Day. Other major events have to be celebrated with a great procession down the Champs-Élysées. The Tour de France, after going across France for a couple of weeks, ends up with the survivors having their grand procession up the Champs-Élysées. Terrorists have also targeted the Champs-Élysées as a symbol of France, sort of like Osama bin Laden targeted the World Trade Center, the buildings in Washington, D.C. They targeted the Capitol as well as the Pentagon as symbols of American might and power. So the Champs-Élysées is often targeted and the Arc de Triomphe as symbols of French greatness. Well, after the Champs-Élysées proper, there is an extension, and this is called the Avenue of the Grande Armée, 5 miles long. Picture on the left is once again at the top of the Arc de Triomphe, looking not towards the Louvre, but looking in the opposite direction along the new stretch of the Champs-Élysées, which goes from the Arc de Triomphe straight on to what is called today Le Défense, the cluster of skyscrapers, which you see in the distance. Picture on the right is closer up, showing this jungle of skyscrapers, marking the addition of a whole new chapter to French history. Well, the Défense came into existence because between 69 and 73, a group of French industrialists and architects and government officials agreed to construct the Tour Montparnasse. And they built this magnificent tower, 60 floors. But when you look at it, you could estimate it's 100 floors because it stands isolated in a traditional section of France, which is marked by church towers and smaller buildings. Well, when this was built, it caused such a scandal. And in fact, until today, there are movements to have it torn down. It is an eyesore. Well, they didn't tear it down, and the train station underneath it is very, very functional. But the government and the residents of Paris decided that henceforth there will be no more skyscrapers in the historic center of Paris. They will be banished to Le Défense. Once again, the name is significant. The defense of Paris against the during the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germans occupied Paris for the first time. But yet the French don't remember the occupation. They do remember the resistance against the occupation. And so it is called Le Défense. Currently, it is 72 buildings and counting. Monument to the right commemorates the defense of Paris against the Prussians. So this is the new Paris. And of course, it is not totally isolated. It is linked to the Grand Avenue, beginning with the Louvre, Place de Concorde, Champs-Élysées, Arc de Triomphe, and then continuing down to the new part of Paris, Le Défense. Well, there is no traditional architecture here. There are no Haussmannian buildings. The architecture is supposed to be splendid, ultra-modern, showing France is moving into the future. 1974, the Palais de Congrès de Paris was built, a giant ultra-modern convention center for all kinds of expositions, fairs, concerts, sports events. When it is going strong, it is packed with tens of thousands of people. The architecture is ultra-modern. The building on the left could well be a Frank Lloyd Wright. His hatred of square buildings and square rooms. Here again, it is curved. Beautiful modern architecture. On the right, another exotic building made of glass, transparent, looks like chunks of buildings super glued to chunks of building. Once again, showing Paris is more than just old history, but it is a major high-tech country and will remain so into the future. The Grand Arc de la Défense finished in 1989. Here again, this corresponds to the Arc de Triomphe, and it is crossing the avenue. And when you look down the Champs-Élysées and down the Avenue de la Grande Armée, you see that they face each other, the Arc de la Défense and the Arc de Triomphe. It is actually a building, 50 floors tall, offices, stores, shops, the whole works. Surrounding plaza with fountains and a big open space, often filled with all kinds of crazy art exhibits and sculpture exhibits, outdoor art performances, and with so many people working in these 70 buildings. It is a jungle of restaurants and shopping centers, its own subway station, and more buildings are going up all the time. Now, there is a plan to continue this Grande Voie from the Louvre on the right through the Tuileries, Place de la Concorde of the obelisk, the stretch of Champs-Élysées ending with the Arc de Triomphe, and then continuing through the Porte Maillot, the Pont de Neuilly, the Défense to the Grand Arc of the Défense. And there is a plan to continue it even further, to make it an even more of a grand monumental avenue. I don't know what the status of the extension is at this point, but the part from the Louvre to the Grand Arc of the Défense is really a thrilling walk. Don't do it on a hot, humid day. You'll have heat stroke, but it is really a wonderful walk. Now, popular culture. Everything becomes popular. Jules Dassin, one of the great French composers and singers, wrote his song, Le Champs-Élysées. And the chorus is on the Champs-Élysées, on the Champs-Élysées, in the sun, in the rain, at noon or midnight. Everything you could want is on the Champs-Élysées. Here again, it is, as it says, the very bottom. Yesterday evening, two strangers, and this morning on the avenue, two lovers dazzled by the long night. And from Étoile de la Concorde, from the Étoile to the Concorde, a 1,000-string orchestra. From the breaking of dawn, all the birds sang about love. Here again, popularized the Champs-Élysées and literally turned it into a cultural icon. Books, the little perfume shop off the Champs-Élysées. Once again, it is off the Champs-Élysées, not on the Champs-Élysées proper. Champs-Élysées is for strolling. Some shops are now opening up there and it is becoming a little bit more popular, but still the perfume shop, once again, associating French perfume with the Champs-Élysées. On the right, you see the Beatles on their grand procession down the Champs-Élysées. Very often you will see caravans of cars carrying some important person or personages going down the Champs-Élysées. Guerlain of Paris has its own eau de parfum named the Champs-Élysées. Finest American culture and dining has made its way to the Champs-Élysées, where you see a great American icon, McDonald's. So many people go there just to have their picture taken at the McDonald's Champs-Élysées. They have their own film festival. There are theaters on Champs-Élysées, movies with Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer, Triumph Bogen, Arc of Triumph, Anthony Hopkins in Arc of Triumph. Recently, a Netflix series, Emily in Paris. Absolutely dreadful, but still it does show Emily at every place in Paris, and not at all strange with her little camera to be walking around taking pictures along the Champs-Élysées. So popular culture has really turned the Champs-Élysées into an icon of class, of sophistication. So no wonder all of these cities that are being built now, such as Brasilia or Berlin or Peter the Great in Paris, in St. Petersburg, or more recently, Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, Abuja in Nigeria, brand new cities must have their imitation of the Champs-Élysées, the Grande Avenue of triumph and of national glory. So this brings us to an end. And as you know, I love visiting cities. And so when I was preparing this program on the Champs-Élysées and the whole history of the Voie Triomphale, I found another one in Berlin. This is the famous Karl Marx Allee, built in East Berlin by the communists as a grand avenue showing the victory of communism over Nazi fascism. Here again, a statement of Karl Marx philosophy, economics, ideology, carved into Berlin, East Berlin. Today, I was there a couple of years ago in August, and that's the time to go to visit the Karl Marx Allee because it claims to have the largest beer festival in the world. I had a wonderful beer from Mongolia, which I didn't even know made beer, but they had their own tent selling Mongolian beer. On the right is another child of the Champs-Élysées, and that is Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City, leaving the old Spanish colonial city behind and making Mexico great. Interestingly, it was one of the few emperors of Mexico, Emperor Maximilian, who laid out the Paseo de la Reforma, saying, it is time for Mexico City to enter the ranks of the great cities of the world. Today, it is being increasingly lined with giant skyscrapers to show that Mexico is a country of the future. So thank you very much for joining me. This is Dr. Ronald Brown. If you have any comments, please feel free to send them to ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. I'm always welcoming comments, criticisms, how I could improve, but as always welcome, personal experiences of the Grand Boulevards. So thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you sometime in the future. So this is Dr. Ronald Brown logging off, and hope you enjoyed the program.